When we hear the words Cold War, most people instantly imagine nuclear weapons, secret spies, and the tense standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. But there was another battlefield that remained invisible to the ordinary eye, a battlefield not fought with bombs or tanks, but with money. This was the economic Cold War, and at the heart of it was a silent struggle between two currencies, the American dollar and the Soviet ruble. After World War II, the world was broken, exhausted, and desperate for stability. Two superpowers emerged, each with its own vision for how the future of global power should look. The United States believed in capitalism, open markets, and the free flow of trade. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, pushed for communism, central control, and state-driven economies. On the surface, it looked like a clash of political ideologies, but deep down, it was also about which currency would dominate global trade and finance. For centuries, gold had been the ultimate standard of wealth. Whoever held gold reserves had economic strength. But by the mid-20th century, the rules were changing. The U.S., with its massive gold reserves and booming post-war economy, saw an opportunity. The Soviets, meanwhile, relied on their controlled ruble system, hoping to tie their allies in Eastern Europe into their financial orbit. It wasn't just about tanks on borders or missiles in silos. It was about whose money the world would trust. This Cold War of dollars was subtle but incredibly powerful. Every loan, every trade deal, every international agreement carried hidden weight. When a country accepted US dollars for its exports, it was indirectly strengthening the American system. When a country traded in rubles within the Soviet bloc, it was showing loyalty to Moscow's vision. Money became a weapon, but unlike a gun, it didn't fire loudly. It worked quietly, influencing entire economies without a single shot being fired. And here lies the hidden truth. The Cold War was never only about nuclear power or military might. It was also about economic influence, about shaping the financial future of the world. The question was simple yet monumental. Would the next generation live in a world ruled by the dollar, or would the ruble become the symbol of global strength? In this session, we set the stage for a journey through one of the most fascinating and least understood aspects of the Cold War. A war where the winners were not just decided on the battlefield, but also in banks, trade offices, and financial treaties. The story of this hidden war is what we're about to uncover. To understand how the United States gained the upper hand in the economic Cold War, we must go back to 1944, when the world gathered at a small town in New Hampshire, USA, Bretton Woods. The war had not yet officially ended, but it was clear that a new financial system was needed to rebuild shattered economies. At this conference, representatives from 44 nations sat down and made a historic decision. The US dollar would become the backbone of the global financial order. Why the dollar? The answer was simple. By the end of World War II, the United States held nearly two-thirds of the world's gold reserves. Gold was still considered the ultimate symbol of wealth and trust. With so much gold stored in American vaults, the dollar was seen as the safest and most reliable currency in the world. The deal was straightforward. Countries could peg their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar itself would be pegged to gold. In other words, the dollar became as good as gold. But America didn't just stop at making agreements. They launched one of the most ambitious reconstruction programs in history, the Marshall Plan. Through this plan, billions of dollars were poured into war-torn Europe to rebuild cities, industries, and infrastructure. This wasn't just charity. Every dollar that went abroad tied those nations more closely to the U.S. economy. By helping Europe stand back on its feet, America was also making sure that the dollar became the center of international trade and investment. For countries receiving aid, this was a lifeline. Factories restarted, railways were repaired, and millions of people found hope in the rebuilding process. But behind the scenes, something deeper was happening. By distributing dollars across Europe, the U.S. was ensuring that foreign banks, governments, and businesses would hold and trust its currency. It was a strategic move that created a global demand for dollars, which still exists today. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union refused to participate in Bretton Woods or accept Marshall Plan aid. From their perspective, this was a trap, a way for the US to expand its influence under the cover of Reconstruction. So, while the West aligned itself with the dollar, the Eastern Bloc tried to build a separate system based on the ruble. This was the moment the financial Cold War truly began. On one side, a dollar backed by gold, spreading across continents through aid and trade. On the other, a ruble tied to strict government control, limited only to the Soviet sphere. The Bretton Woods Agreement and the Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild Europe, they built the foundation of what we now call the dollar empire. And this empire was about to challenge the Soviet Union in ways far beyond the battlefield. While the dollar was gaining strength through Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan, the Soviet Union faced a very different challenge: how to make the ruble a global currency. On paper, the USSR was a superpower with massive land, resources, and military might. But when it came to money, the ruble was trapped inside a system that the rest of the world simply didn't trust. The Soviet leadership knew they couldn't join the Western-led system without losing control. So, in 1949, they created an alternative, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, better known as Comecon. This was supposed to be the Eastern Bloc's answer to the dollar system. Member countries like East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and others were expected to trade using the ruble, building a financial network that excluded the West. But there was a problem. Unlike the dollar, which was pegged to gold and freely traded around the world, the ruble had no global standard of value. It was not convertible into other currencies. This meant that if a country wanted to trade with the Soviet Union, it had to accept rubles that could only be spent within the Eastern Bloc. Outside that circle, the ruble was practically worthless. This limited the ruble's reach. Nations outside the Soviet orbit preferred to deal in dollars because they could use those dollars anywhere, in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East. Even within the Eastern Bloc, resentment grew. Countries like Czechoslovakia and East Germany realized they were tied to a currency that offered no flexibility, locking them into Moscow's control. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's own policies weakened the ruble further. The economy was centrally planned, meaning prices were fixed by the state, not by market forces. This created artificial values that had no connection to global trade realities. A ton of steel in the Soviet Union might be worth a certain number of rubles, but on the international market, the same steel could fetch far less in dollars. The gap between official and real value grew wider, exposing the ruble's weakness. Ordinary Soviet citizens also understood this reality. Many of them saw the ruble as unreliable and, whenever possible, secretly tried to get their hands on US dollars. The black market thrived, where dollars were exchanged at much higher rates than the official ruble value. For many people, holding a dollar bill felt safer than trusting their own currency. The result was clear. While the ruble remained trapped within the borders of the Soviet bloc, the dollar was becoming the world's passport to trade and investment. The Soviet Union could control its allies with the ruble, but it could never convince the rest of the world to accept it. In this struggle, the ruble wasn't just losing value, it was losing the fight for legitimacy. And as the decades passed, this weakness would become one of the Soviet Union's greatest vulnerabilities in the Cold War of dollars. By the 1950s and 1960s, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union had moved beyond weapons and territory. It was now clear that the real battlefield was economic power. Both sides poured enormous resources into proving their systems were stronger: capitalism versus communism, dollars versus rubles. But in this silent war, the United States began pulling ahead in ways that would reshape the world. The US dollar's greatest weapon came in the 1970s when America struck a historic deal with Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing nations. The agreement was simple but revolutionary. All oil exports would be priced and sold exclusively in US dollars. This system became known as the petrodollar. Since every nation needed oil, every nation now needed dollars. This guaranteed a constant global demand for the American currency and cemented its position as the backbone of international trade. For the Soviet Union, the situation was much harder. Oil and gas were among their biggest exports, but they couldn't force the world to trade in rubles. Most international buyers still preferred dollars because they were reliable, convertible, and universally accepted. The USSR tried to hold its allies inside the Comecon system, but even those nations quietly looked for ways to access dollars for trade outside the Eastern Bloc. At the same time, the arms race and the space race were bleeding the Soviet economy. Competing with the US in military spending meant pouring billions of rubles into tanks, missiles, and rockets, while Americans could finance their defense programs through a strong dollar and global trade. The Soviets relied on a closed, centrally planned economy. The pressure kept building. Another turning point came during the oil crises of the 1970s. When global oil prices skyrocketed, the U.S. benefited because the petrodollar system ensured that every transaction strengthened its currency. The Soviets also earned short-term profits from selling oil, but the volatility of the market exposed their dependence. Unlike the U.S., which could manage crises with its financial system, the USSR lacked the flexibility to adapt. Meanwhile, in the everyday lives of people around the world, the dollar was becoming a symbol of stability. From Europe to Asia, holding dollars meant security. In contrast, the ruble remained stuck behind the Iron Curtain, unwanted by anyone who wasn't forced to use it. This was the essence of the economic Cold War. The U.S. wasn't just winning on the battlefield of technology or military strength, it was winning in banks, oil markets, and trade agreements. Every new dollar transaction tightened America's grip on the world economy, and every failure of the ruble revealed the limits of the Soviet model. By the end of the 1970s, the Soviet Union was still standing tall militarily, but economically it was already showing cracks. The Cold War of dollars was tilting heavily in America's favor. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the Soviet Union appeared outwardly powerful. Its military was vast, its influence stretched across Eastern Europe, and it still claimed to be an equal rival to the United States. But beneath the surface, serious cracks had begun to appear in its economic foundation, cracks that the dollar-centered system of the West only made wider. One of the most damaging blows came from the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Beginning in 1979, the USSR poured billions of rubles into a war that drained its resources and morale. Much like the U.S. had suffered in Vietnam, the Soviets found themselves stuck in a costly conflict with no clear victory. While soldiers fought on the ground, the economy back home suffered. Funds that could have modernized industries or stabilized consumer goods were instead being swallowed by the war effort. At the same time, global oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s. This was devastating for the Soviet Union because oil was its lifeline. For years, high oil prices had masked deeper problems in the Soviet economy. But once prices fell, the weaknesses were impossible to hide. Suddenly, the government could not earn enough foreign currency, especially dollars, to sustain its imports or finance its budget. Meanwhile, inside the Soviet Union, ordinary people were losing faith in the ruble. Stores were empty, goods were rationed, and black markets thrived. In these underground markets, US dollars became the currency of choice. A single dollar could often buy more than stacks of rubles, highlighting how little trust people had in their own money. This wasn't just an economic problem, it was a psychological defeat. When citizens prefer a foreign currency over their own, it signals a collapse of confidence in the system itself. The Soviet model of central planning also became a heavy burden. Factories produced goods that nobody wanted, farms failed to meet quotas, and innovation stalled. In the West, capitalism and free trade fueled rapid technological and financial growth. In the East, the rigidity of the system left the USSR falling further behind. Even allies within the Eastern Bloc grew restless. Countries like Poland faced economic crises and began questioning Moscow's control, further weakening the ruble's reach. While all this unfolded, the dollar kept gaining strength. The petrodollar system ensured constant demand, and U.S. financial institutions grew more influential worldwide. By the mid-1980s, the gap between the two economic systems had become undeniable. America was not just wealthier, it was more adaptable, more trusted, and more connected to the global market. The cracks in the Soviet system were no longer hidden. They were widening, and soon they would lead to a collapse that would not only end the ruble's chances of global dominance, but also bring down the Soviet Union itself. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was reaching a breaking point. The cracks in its economic system had grown so wide that no amount of propaganda could hide them. Empty shelves, food shortages, and the growing black market revealed a reality that the world could see clearly. The Soviet ruble was collapsing, and with it, the dream of an alternative global financial order. In contrast, the US dollar was stronger than ever. The world had fully embraced the petrodollar system, and international institutions like the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank operated primarily in dollars. For developing nations, receiving aid or loans meant dealing with U.S. currency. For global trade, settling accounts in dollars became the standard. The more the world used the dollar, the more powerful it became. Meanwhile, inside the USSR, the ruble was practically worthless outside its own borders. Even Soviet citizens themselves didn't trust it. In cities like Moscow and Leningrad, people turned to dollars whenever possible. The black market exchange rate exposed the truth. The official value of the ruble was a fiction, and everyone knew it. The psychological defeat was almost as devastating as the economic one. In 1991, the inevitable happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. 15 independent republics emerged from the ruins, and with them, the ruble lost its status as the currency of a superpower. Each new country struggled to establish its own financial identity, but none of them could compete with the dominance of the US dollar. For the United States, the end of the Cold War was not just a geopolitical victory, but also an economic triumph. The dollar was now undisputed as the world's reserve currency. It wasn't just a medium of exchange, it had become a symbol of power, trust, and stability. Nations around the globe held dollar reserves, international contracts were written in dollars, and oil, the lifeblood of modern economies, was still traded exclusively in dollars. The Soviet collapse also highlighted the ultimate failure of the ruble. It had never gained international acceptance, never become a currency that other nations wanted to hold. Where the dollar was flexible, convertible, and universally trusted, the ruble was rigid, restricted, and unreliable. In the end, the Cold War wasn't only lost on the battlefield of politics or ideology, it was lost in the wallets of ordinary people. The fall of the ruble and the rise of the dollar marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The United States emerged as not just a military superpower, but the financial superpower of the world. And the dollar, quietly but firmly, became the most powerful weapon America ever wielded. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 ended the political Cold War, but the story of the dollar Cold War didn't stop there. In fact, its legacy continues to shape the world we live in today. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, and the dollar became more than just a currency. It became the foundation of the modern global economy. After the fall of the ruble, nearly every major international transaction flowed through the US dollar. From oil in the Middle East to electronics in Asia, trade contracts were written in dollars. Nations began stockpiling dollar reserves in their central banks, not just as a financial tool, but as a shield of security. To this day, more than 80% of global trade is conducted in dollars. That dominance traces back to the economic victories of the Cold War era. But the dollar's power goes beyond trade. International institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, both heavily influenced by the US, continued to operate primarily in dollars. Countries in financial crisis often turned to these institutions for help, which meant turning to the American-led financial system. The dollar was no longer just America's currency, it was the world's. For the Soviet Union's successor states, the story was much different. Russia struggled through economic chaos in the 1990s, with hyperinflation eroding trust in its new version of the ruble. Former Soviet republics each introduced their own currencies, but none achieved global significance. The dream of the ruble as a competitor to the dollar was gone, buried with the Soviet Union itself. Even today, challenges to the dollar's supremacy remain limited. China promotes the yuan, and new technologies like cryptocurrencies aim to change the financial landscape. Yet none have managed to replace the dollar's deep trust and universal acceptance. Oil is still traded in dollars, most international loans are given in dollars, and global investors continue to see the dollar as the ultimate safe haven. This lasting dominance proves something important. The Cold War wasn't only won with military might or political maneuvering. It was won in the quiet strength of financial systems, where the dollar outlasted and outperformed the ruble. The United States didn't just defeat the Soviet Union. It built an economic empire that continues to influence the fate of nations today. The legacy of the dollar Cold War is all around us. Every time a country buys oil, takes a loan, or settles a trade deal in US dollars, it is a reminder of how that hidden financial battle shaped our world. Missiles may have gone silent, but the power of the dollar still speaks louder than ever.